Today we're going to finish chapter 12, God willing. Up to now, chapter 12 was all about Nathan's rebuke and David's tshuva and his punishment, where his young child dies after 7 days. That's basically what was covered in chapter 12. And so from chapter 11 until now, towards the end of chapter 12, we've been basically dealing with the David Bathsheba Uriah episode. Now, though, in these last few verses of the chapter, we're going to deal with the Jewish army fighting the Ammonites, which might seem like a totally different subject, but actually, these last few verses, they complete a cycle. Because think of how this whole thing started. Back in chapter 10, David sends messengers to pay a shiva call to the king of Ammon. David's servants, they get abused, they get humiliated. And when David hears what happens, he sends Yoav and the army to make those Ammonites pay for what they did. But Ammon hires out Aram to join them, and then Yoav and Avishai were taken by surprise, and they managed to defeat Aram and keep Ammon at bay. We learned all about that in chapter 10. So Aram had been defeated, but the Ammonites, who were responsible for this whole thing, they were in their fortified city. So what happened? Yoav went out to battle against Ammon to finally finish him off. And that was the backdrop of this whole Uriah Bathsheba episode. Am Yisrael was at war. King David was walking on his rooftop in Jerusalem during that time. And Uriah, when he was sent to battle to be killed, that was during the fighting against the Ammonites. So whatever happened in that war against the Ammonites? Well, that's what we are going to learn now. So what's happening is we're coming full circle. We're going back to that war of Bnei Israel against Ammon. And even though there's just a couple of verses left that describe this war, I wanted to spend a complete shiur on these verses because it's an opportunity to learn what we call Jewish war ethics. You know, we hear a lot about it. We hear during the war in Gaza that there's purity of arms and there's civilians that you have to be careful not to harm them. But the question is taking into consideration the civilian population of the enemy. What does Judaism say about that? We hear all the time that the IDF is a moral army. It takes into account innocent civilians more than any other army, etc. The question is that the proper way to conduct a war? What are Jewish war ethics anyway? How does a Jewish soldier conduct himself in war? Well, by learning Tanakh, we get that understanding of how you're supposed to fight a war. We can open the book of Joshua. We can read about the wars of David HaMelech. That's our model. And that's why it's so important to learn Tanakh, because it teaches you concepts, ideas, something you're not going to get in the Talmud or the Mishnah or the Halacha. By learning Tanakh, you learn what we call big picture Judaism. You see the forest and not just the trees, the individual trees. The Gemara, the Talmud, it's like little trees, another halacha, another sugya. But to see the whole picture from above, that's the Tanakh, that's the forest. So let's get to it, chapter 12, verse 26, where Yoav is going to try to conquer Ammon. It says in verse 26, Vayelechem Yoav berabat b'nei Ammon. And Yoav fought against Rabbah, the children of Ammon. Vayilkod et ira melucha. And he captured the royal city. What does he do next? Verse 27, Vayishlach Yoav malachim el David. And Yoav sent messengers to David. Vayomer, and he said, Nilchamti berabba gam lakadati et iramayim. He says to David, I have fought against Rabbah, that is the major city of Ammon, and I have taken the city of waters. Okay, so this conquest of Ammon is coming in stages. First, he captures the royal city, but he's not done. His next step is to conquer the city where the water supply is. He wants to cut off their water supply. And when he does that, he knows he's vanquished them completely. So he wants to conquer the city of the water, which is on the outskirts near the water supply. And by the way, this is the very opposite of what we do in Gaza. In Gaza, we send them aid. We send them supplies, water, fuel. And so the war draws out forever. It's the opposite of what Yoav's doing. Yoav knows that in order to win, you want to shut down their water and their electricity, etc. because he doesn't want to draw this thing out. Okay, so what happened? Yoav told David that he's captured the city of waters. Now listen to what happens now. It's verse 28. Vata, Yoav tells David, Esofet Yetaram, muster up the rest of the troops, Vechana Elair, and you besiege the city, Velachta, and you capture the city. So Yoav wants David to finish off the job and capture this city by the water, which is really easy pickings. The heavy lifting Yoav already did, but he wants David to come in now and capture this particular city by the water. Why does Yoav want David to come and do it? He explains it. Pen el kod aniyat, because if not, I will take this city, v'nikra shmi aleh, and it will be named after me. So Yoav is being very cool here. He wants David to join the battle so that David will get the credit for the victory. So that's very interesting that Yoav wants David to get the credit, because we're going to see that Yoav basically does what he wants, and he doesn't always listen to David. But that doesn't mean he doesn't always have David's interests in mind. Even when he's disobeying David, as we're going to see later on, he thinks he's doing what's best for David's malchut. And here's an example. He's saying, I want you to get the credit for this. Even though Yoav has already conquered like 90% of Ammon, he wants David to come in now and finish it off, so the victory will be called on his name. That's what Yoav says here. I don't want it to be called al Shmi. I don't want this victory to be called on my name. I want you to get the credit. Now, it's very possible that Yoav knows about the scandal. Well, he knows about the scandal. He was actually part of it. He put Uriah in the front lines. But it might be that Yoav thinks or knows that the scandal may have gotten out, and David's popularity may not be at an all-time high, because if the people know what happened, that is not good for him. And we'll discuss later on whether the Bathsheba episode ever became known outside the king's courtyard. Apparently it did get out. We'll get to that later. Anyway, Yoav is here trying to build David's brand. He wants him to come in and finish it off. And that's what happens. David brings more troops, and they finish off the Ammonites. And now we're going to see what David did to them after he conquers them. And this is what it says. He took the crown of their king off his head, and its weight was a talent of gold, a precious stone. So he's got this heavy crown, and it was set on David's head. So David puts the crown on his head, and the spoil of the city he brought forth in great abundance. So now that King David has conquered them, he mocks them by wearing the crown of their king. But we're not done. Now listen to what he does to the Ammonites. Now this isn't me speaking here, okay? I'm just reading the verses. We're in Shmuel 2, chapter 12, the final verse. Fasten your seatbelts. Because remember, we are the most moral army in the world. Okay, what does it say here? What did David do now? And he brought forth the people that were inside Ammon, and put them under saws, and under harrows of iron, and under axes. In other words, he is torturing them. According to the commentators, he's tearing off their flesh, and he made them pass through the brick kiln. And so that must hurt, going through a brick kiln. It's pretty hot. And finally the verse finishes, and so he did to all the cities of the children of Ammon. And David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. Okay, so how is that for purity of arms, for Jewish conduct of war? Now, it's important to understand, it's not that David does this to every enemy, okay? The Ammonites, they were special. They were like the Arabs of Gaza. The Ammonites had, back in chapter 10, publicly humiliated David's emissaries. Remember that story? David sent messengers to the king of Ammon to pay him a shiva call, because the king of Ammon's father, who David had a connection to, had passed away. So King David made the mistake of sending messengers to Ammon to pay respects to the son, give him a condolence call. Again, we learned this in chapter 10. And what did the Ammonites do? They took the emissaries, cut off half their beards, and cut off their clothes halfway up to their rear ends, and they sent them back in shame, parading them through the streets of Ammon. So the Ammonites nationally disgraced the nation of Israel. And so what David is doing here is he's restoring the honor of Israel that had been humiliated. It was payback time. They had this coming to them, just like the Arabs in Gaza have it coming to them when they paraded the Jewish hostages in the streets of Gaza to the cheering crowds. Now, if you recall the shiur we had on chapter 8, a couple chapters ago, that's the chapter of the wars of David HaMelech against Edom, against Aram, against Moab. We see that he did a similar thing to the Moabites that he captured. It was a different kind of torture and abuse, but it certainly wasn't something pleasant. What did he do after conquering Moab? It says in chapter 8, verse 2, he smote Moab and measured them off with a cord, making them lie down on the ground. And he measured 2 cord lengths to death and 1 cord length to life. So he humiliates them by having them lie down, and he arbitrarily or randomly, he marks off every 2 Moabites for death and the third one for life. And he did this for a similar reason that he tortured the Ammonites, because he had a vendetta against the Moabites, because the Moabites murdered his family. And we got into that if you listen to my shiur on chapter 8 or chapter 22 in Shmuel 1. You can get all the details. But what we see is this. There's something called a Melchemet Nikama, a war of vengeance. A war of vengeance, it has its own rules. It's tailored according to what the enemy did to you. It's not your regular Melchemet Mitzvah. It's a type of Melchemet Mitzvah. It's a type of an obligatory war, but it has the added element of vengeance because you're avenging something specific that was done to you by that nation. And that's why David gave special treatment to Ammon and Moab. When David smote Hadadezer of Aram, he didn't abuse them. He didn't torture them. He conquered them. He took taxes from them. He subjugated them economically, and that's it. It all depends on the situation. But one thing's for sure, there is no such thing as a war that you don't try to win. Once that war starts, you go in to win it and to finish it off. As David says in Psalms 22, Lo ashuv at chalotam. I'm not returning until I wipe all of them out. So, when people say that the IDF is the most moral army today, no. Being moral is going in the way of the Torah, in the way of King David, and not sacrificing your soldiers for their citizens. And King David didn't just do this as a punishment. This was also a deterrent. He wants to terrify the nations that nobody ever dare humiliate a Jew again. He's telling the world, don't mess with us. So yeah, that's King David, Na'im Zmirot Yisrael, the sweet psalmist and singer of Israel. And how sweet it is that we learn from him all about Jewish war ethics. And that's why I wanted to dedicate a shiur just to these verses, so we see what's the way of Jewish warfare. How does a Jewish army fight? Because that's part of Judaism, just like Shabbat and kosher food is part of Judaism. There's no such thing as politics in Judaism. We don't separate church from state. It's all one, and the Torah has what to say about how to fight a war. And so to this point, there's a verse in Deuteronomy, chapter 20, the very first verse. It says like this, Ki tetzei lemilchama olivecha, when you go out to war against your enemies. That's the beginning of the verse. So the rabbis ask, what do you mean go to war on your enemies? After all, one doesn't go out to war against his friends. Of course you go out to war on your enemies. So the Midrash Tanchuma answers, the Almighty said, go against them as enemies, just as they will not have mercy upon you, have no mercy upon them. In other words, if they win, they're not going to have mercy on you. They're going to torture you. They're going to rape your women. They're going to burn your children. Think about that when you go out to war and don't have mercy on them. And so we see that there really is a huge difference between the morality of true Judaism and the perverted ethics of the Hellenist Jews. And, it's not just Judaism. It's just normal not to deliberately sacrifice your soldiers in order to save the enemy who's not in a uniform. And so the concept of purity of arms is a warp of ethics. Rabbi Kahana used to say to those that would say, we can't be like them. We're not like them. We're better than they are. He would say, yeah, better, but deader. And so this twisted logic of having pity on your enemy, it's really part of the sick legacy of the ghetto Jew, who has a sad need to be loved that causes us to die and thus prove to the world how moral we really are. So he can love us. After we're dead, of course. Posthumously, he can love us. Okay, so I hope these final verses here didn't shock you. We'll be back next week, back to the drama, to the drama inside David's household. We're going to see the beginning of the punishment where the prophet said that the sword will not depart from your home. All that is going to start to play out beginning in chapter 13, and we'll learn that next week.